In a small village in Vietnam, in the year 1928, a baby boy was born into a poor farming family. His name was Pham Van Nan, but history would come to know him simply as Brother Marcel Van. His childhood was not like that of most children. From his earliest days, Van seemed to carry a hidden fire within him. While other boys dreamed of play or adventure, he dreamed of God. By the time he could speak clearly, his heart already burned with the desire to give his life to Christ. At the age of 6, he prepared eagerly for his first Holy Communion. Most children his age could not understand the depth of such a sacrament, but Van approached it with complete seriousness. He made 2 requests of Jesus on that day. The first was not for himself, but for others. He prayed that every person in the world might be blessed with a strong and unshakable faith. The second request was deeply personal. He asked that his own heart would remain pure, so that he could love Jesus with all the strength of his soul. From that moment, it was clear his path would be unlike anyone else's. Just 1 year later, at the tender age of 7, Van begged his mother to allow him to go live with a priest in another town so he could begin his training for the priesthood. Imagine the courage of such a small boy leaving home, family, and comfort behind, simply to follow the faint call of God. His mother, though hesitant, agreed. And so little Van walked into the unknown, with only trust and childlike faith to guide him. At the rectory of Hubang, where he began his formation, Van quickly learned that the path of holiness is never without suffering. Among the boys studying with him, jealousy arose. One catechist, envious of Van's devotion, began tormenting him cruelly. He told Van that he could only receive communion if he accepted to be beaten first. He forbade him from praying the rosary. He even deprived him of food. Van endured this silently, offering his pain to God. He would later write that it was only thanks to the protection of the Blessed Virgin Mary that he was able to withstand these torments without losing faith. The devil never won, he reflected. Eventually, the priest of the parish discovered the cruelty of the catechist. The abuser was dismissed, and Van remained safe. But the scars of those trials marked him deeply. Even as a child, he had learned what it meant to unite suffering with love. Soon, more hardships struck. His family's rice fields were destroyed by typhoons, plunging them into poverty. His father fell into drinking and gambling, unable to provide stability. With no money for studies, Van had to work at the rectory as a servant instead of continuing his priestly training. The dream of becoming a priest seemed to slip further and further away. Discouraged, weighed down by hardship, and misunderstood even by his own family, Van left the seminary for a time. For 2 months, the boy wandered the streets with nowhere to go, enduring hunger, cold, and loneliness. His family, ashamed of what they saw as his failure, rejected him. But God was not finished with him. One day, after enduring humiliation and rejection, a priest from Hubang intervened. He recognized the boy's innocence and purity and affirmed that his heart was still open to God. This recognition brought Van back to life. Around this time, he heard Jesus speaking to him interiorly. Christ gave him a mission that would define his whole existence, to turn suffering into joy. It was a call so simple, yet so profound. In a world that feared suffering, Jesus invited Van to embrace it, to transform it through love. Reignited by this call, Van returned to the seminary with new determination. He gathered younger boys around him, teaching them to pray and to live with faith, even amid hardship. They called themselves the Angels of the Resistance. Even at such a young age, he was already becoming a leader of souls, pointing others to hope when despair seemed inevitable. By the time he was 13, he entered a minor seminary run by the Dominican friars. But his path was interrupted again. Only 6 months later, The seminary was forced to close due to the Japanese military occupation. It seemed that every time he tried to follow the road toward priesthood, it was blocked. But once again, God had other plans. For in this time of confusion and delay, Van would discover a small book that would change everything, and introduce him to the saint who would become his heavenly sister and guide. That book was the story of a soul, written by a young French nun named Thérèse of Lisieux. When the seminary closed, Van had to continue his studies in another parish. He was discouraged, but in those days he came across a book that seemed small and unimpressive at first glance. It was called Story of a Soul, the autobiography of a French Carmelite nun, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. At first, Van didn't like the book. He found it childish, too simple for the struggles he was facing. How could such simple words help him when life was full of suffering, humiliation, and disappointment? Yet something in the pages kept calling him back. He read a little more each day, and slowly the heart of Thérèse began to speak to his. The more he read, the more he discovered that this little nun had faced her own trials: weakness, sickness, misunderstanding, and the fear of being too small for God. And yet, she had transformed all of it into love. She had built her entire life on one great truth: that even the smallest soul could reach heaven, not by heroic deeds, but by trust and love. This simple but radical teaching was what she called her little way. One day, as Van prayed after reading, something extraordinary happened. Saint Thérèse herself appeared to him. She was radiant with joy and kindness, yet humble and gentle, just as she had described herself in her book. She spoke to him not like a distant saint, but like a close sister. She told him that she wanted to be his friend and companion. She promised to walk with him and teach him her little way. From that day forward, a spiritual friendship began, one that would shape the rest of Van's life. Thérèse explained to him that God's love was not reserved for the strong, the powerful, or the perfect. No, it was for the small, the broken, and the weak, those who knew they could do nothing without him. She reminded Van to speak with God as with a friend, to tell him everything, even the smallest details of daily life. She even teased him gently about his struggles. "Don't be afraid of your weakness," she would say, "because it makes you even more lovable to God." Thérèse also challenged him. At that time, Van carried bitterness toward the French, whose colonial rule had caused so much suffering in Vietnam. But Thérèse, herself French, asked him to pray for them, to forgive, and to love them. At first, he resisted. How could he love those who had hurt his people? But Thérèse explained that God's love makes no distinction between nations or races. In his eyes, every person is his child. Through these conversations, Van's heart began to soften. He saw that holiness meant not only loving God, but also forgiving and loving others, even enemies. But Therese was not the only one who came to him. In the silence of prayer, Jesus himself began to speak to Van. These were not grand revelations of distant mysteries, but tender, intimate words. Sometimes Jesus would laugh with him. Sometimes he would gently correct him. At other times he would simply reassure him of his boundless love. Van once asked Jesus if he had ever tasted bananas. Jesus smiled and answered that he had not, because bananas did not exist in his time in Palestine. Such exchanges might seem small, but they revealed something profound. That God cared even about the little curiosities of a poor Vietnamese boy, that his love entered even the ordinary moments of life. The Virgin Mary also visited him, as a gentle mother who comforted and encouraged him. And one day, he even saw Saint Alphonsus Liguori, the founder of the Redemptorists, though at first he mistook him for Our Lady of Sorrows because of his appearance. All of these encounters confirmed something deep in Van's soul. that God was inviting him to a special mission, a mission not of greatness in the world's eyes, but of hidden love. This mission took clearer shape when he felt drawn to join the Redemptorist order, inspired by their devotion to the poor and their love for Christ the Redeemer. Saint Thérèse confirmed this to him in one of their conversations, telling him that it was indeed God's will. Yet the path was not smooth. The missionary guiding him wanted him to join the Dominicans instead. When Van refused, insisting that God was calling him to the Redemptorists, he was accused of being stubborn and prideful. Once again, he was misunderstood, and once again he had to leave the seminary. But Van did not give up. He returned to the rectory, stayed briefly with relatives, and finally was admitted to the Redemptorists, first as an assistant gardener at age 16. Humble work, unnoticed by the world, but done with love. 2 months later, he was accepted as a postulant, and in time as a brother. He would never be a priest. His path would be hidden, quiet, and small. And yet, in that smallness, something immense was unfolding. His novice master, Father Antonio, saw his sincerity and encouraged him to write down all his conversations with Jesus, Mary, and Saint Thérèse. At first, Van hesitated who would believe him. But Father Antonio insisted. These writings were not just for him, but for the whole church. And so, in notebooks filled with simple words, Brother Marcel began to write. These pages would one day become a treasure, a record of divine intimacy, laughter, tears, and lessons of love. Through them, the little way of Saint Thérèse would find new life in distant Vietnam, carried by the heart of a boy who thought himself too small, but whom God considered precious. At last, Marcel Van had found his spiritual home with the Redemptorists. He was only 16 when he entered their community, first working quietly as a gardener, then becoming a postulant, and soon after, a novice. His path was not one of recognition or prestige. Unlike many who entered the seminary with hopes of priesthood, Van accepted that he would remain a religious brother, hidden and simple. He did not preach from pulpits or lead missions. Instead, his holiness was lived in the small tasks of daily life: cleaning, gardening, helping in the community. But in those hidden duties, his soul blossomed in extraordinary ways. His novice master, Father Antonio, quickly noticed the young brother's special grace. Marcel was filled with joy even in hardship, and he spoke of intimate conversations with Jesus, the Blessed Mother, and Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. At first, Father Antonio wondered if the boy's imagination had carried him away. But the purity and depth of Marcel's soul convinced him that these were genuine encounters. To help him, Father Antonio gave him a mission. Write down everything you hear and experience. Do not keep it only for yourself. At first, Marcel hesitated. But Father, he said, who would believe me? I am small, weak, and often forgetful. Surely these things are not meant for others. But Father Antonio insisted. Precisely because you are small, God wants the world to hear through you. Your weakness is your strength, for it proves that it is truly the Lord who speaks. And so, Marcel began to fill notebooks. His writings were not polished theology or complicated philosophy. They were simple conversations of the heart. In them, Jesus spoke to him with tenderness, humor, and affection. Sometimes Jesus would laugh with him, as a friend laughs with a child. Sometimes he would gently scold him for worrying too much. At other times, he reassured him. You are weak, yes, but that makes you dear to me. I do not love you because you are strong, but because you are mine. Marcel often confessed his forgetfulness. Lord, he would say, I cannot even remember the words you spoke to me yesterday. And Jesus would smile. It does not matter. You do not need to remember everything. What matters is that you love me. Your role is simple: to love and to write." Through these writings, Marcel became like a spiritual child of Saint Thérèse. She had promised to spend her heaven doing good on earth, and now, in Vietnam, she was keeping that promise. She taught him her little way in even greater detail: trust in God's mercy, embrace of smallness, and the offering of every little act as an expression of love. Marcel once worried that his sins and weaknesses were too great. Therese answered with motherly firmness, "Do not be afraid. God does not ask for your perfection, only for your trust." The Blessed Virgin Mary also appeared to him, not as a distant queen, but as a tender mother. She comforted him in trials, encouraged him when he felt alone, and reminded him always to look to her Son with confidence. Saint Alphonsus Liguori, the founder of the Redemptorists, also came to him in a vision, confirming his vocation to the congregation. Marcel had once mistaken him for Our Lady of Sorrows, but soon recognized the founder's fatherly presence. Meanwhile, life in the monastery was demanding. The Redemptorists lived a strict schedule of prayer, work, and study, but Marcel embraced it with joy. His hidden life was rich with grace. He never sought attention or praise. Instead, he lived in silence and humility, letting his heart remain open to heaven. By the time he was 17, he made his religious vows and became a full member of the Redemptorists. From then on, he would be known as Brother Marcel. His brothers in the community saw in him a man of deep joy, even though he remained fragile in body. They often remarked on the childlike trust that radiated from him. He seemed to live constantly in the presence of God, as if heaven were always just a breath away. And indeed, through his notebooks, heaven was drawing near. Father Antonio carefully preserved these writings, recognizing that they were not merely for Marcel, but for the Church. They were a testimony that even the smallest soul could speak to God as a friend and be loved by him in return. Marcel's life in the monastery was short, but it carried an eternal fragrance. Each page he wrote, each prayer he whispered, each sacrifice he offered in silence became a seed planted for the future. But that future would not be easy. The world around him was changing. The winds of politics and war were sweeping through Vietnam. And soon, Marcel's hidden life of love would be tested in a furnace of suffering, a test that would make his mission clearer than ever. The year was 1954, and Vietnam was in turmoil. After years of war, the country was divided along the 17th parallel. In the south, a fragile democracy was taking shape. In the north, the communists took power, determined to wipe out religion and silence the church. Thousands of Catholics fled southward to find freedom. They carried with them statues of Mary, crucifixes, and rosaries, fearing that faith would be crushed under the new regime. But Brother Marcel Van chose a different path. He begged his Redemptorist superiors, "Please, let me stay in the north. Someone must remain to love Christ here. Someone must be his witness among those who no longer believe." It was a dangerous choice, but his heart was firm. The little way of Therese had taught him that holiness was not about escape, but about fidelity. He wanted to remain hidden in the midst of darkness, like a small lamp shining where hope seemed lost. For a time, he continued his life quietly. But the eyes of the regime were everywhere. The government suspected any Catholic who remained faithful to the Church. One day, as he walked through the marketplace, Brother Marcel was arrested. He was accused of being a threat to the new order and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. Prison life was brutal. The guards demanded endless hours of crushing work, carrying heavy loads, digging and cutting under the burning sun. Food was scarce, water was dirty, and disease spread quickly. Yet even in this place of suffering, Marcel remained joyful. He smiled at his fellow prisoners. He encouraged them when they were beaten down by despair. He whispered prayers, sang hymns quietly, and reminded them that God had not abandoned them. He became, in secret, a priestly heart among them, not with ordination, but with love. One day, he came up with a daring plan. The prisoners longed for the Eucharist, for the presence of Jesus among them. But there was no way to bring communion into the camp. Marcel decided to try. He disguised himself in women's clothing, attempting to sneak out and return with the Blessed Sacrament hidden on his person. It was an act of incredible courage, but he was caught. The punishment was severe. He was beaten, humiliated, and left weakened. Still, he did not complain. He offered even this suffering as love for Jesus. His mission, given years earlier, echoed in his heart, to turn suffering into joy. Slowly, the hardships began to break his fragile body. Exhaustion consumed him. Tuberculosis ate away at his strength. His once youthful frame became thin and frail. Yet his spirit remained radiant. Other prisoners later recalled how, even near death, Brother Marcel would smile and speak of heaven. He told them, "Do not be afraid. Even here, God is with us. Our weakness is precious to Him." As the months passed, his health declined further. His body could not endure the relentless labor, the lack of food, the sickness that spread in the camp. Finally, worn down by suffering, he surrendered his soul to God in 1959, at just 31 years old. There was no grand funeral, no public recognition. He was buried quietly, another nameless victim of oppression. To the world, he seemed to vanish. But in the eyes of heaven, his life was a triumph. He had remained faithful until the end. He had loved in secret, suffered with joy, and kept the flame of faith alive in the darkest of places. His hidden mission had been fulfilled, to be a small soul who revealed the immense love of God. The world did not know it yet, but the writings he had left behind preserved by Father Antonio, his novice master, would one day carry his voice far beyond the prison walls. The little way of Therese had reached Vietnam through Brother Marcel, and from there, it would one day inspire countless souls around the globe. When Brother Marcel Van died in 1959, the world barely noticed. He was one of countless prisoners lost to exhaustion and disease in the harsh labor camps of communist Vietnam. No monuments were raised. No crowds gathered to honor him. His body was placed in the ground, and silence covered his story. But God had not forgotten. Before his death, Marcel had entrusted his soul and his writings to his spiritual director, Father Antonio. This wise Redemptorist had seen from the beginning that Marcel's notebooks, filled with conversations with Jesus, Mary, and Saint Thérèse, were not simply the musings of a devout young man. They were a treasury of grace, meant to speak to the Church in times to come. With great care, Father Antonio preserved these writings. Later, they were carried out of Vietnam and eventually brought to Canada, where they could be studied and shared safely. For years, Father Antonio worked tirelessly to translate them into French, so that others could hear Marcel's voice. He spent 2 decades of his life on this task, making sure that the world would not lose the hidden testimony of this little brother of Christ. And slowly, the Church began to recognize the extraordinary depth of Marcel's mission. In his writings, we do not find lofty theology or complicated philosophy. Instead, we find the same simplicity that made Saint Thérèse so beloved. Marcel spoke to Jesus as a child to a father, with honesty, humor, and even complaints. He admitted his weaknesses, his forgetfulness, his discouragements. And in reply, Jesus responded not with condemnation, but with tenderness. "Your weakness is precious to me," Jesus told him. Do not be afraid of being small. It is because you are small that I love you so much." These words became the heart of Marcel's mission. Just as Therese had shown that holiness was possible for the littlest soul, Marcel became her echo in Vietnam, proof that the little way was not bound by culture, geography, or time. It was universal, offered to every person who feels inadequate, forgotten, or weak. Through Marcel, the message of heaven became clear. God does not wait for us to be perfect before He loves us. He loves us in our weakness, and it is precisely our weakness that draws His mercy most powerfully. This message spread far and wide. Devotion to Brother Marcel grew quietly but steadily. Many began to call him the little brother of Saint Thérèse, a spiritual child of the little flower who carried her mission into the 20th century. The Church took notice. His cause for canonization was opened, and today he is honored with the title Servant of God. Step by step, his life and writings are being studied, and many faithful around the world are discovering the hidden treasure of his story. For those who read his words, something remarkable happens. They feel that they are not alone in their weakness. They discover that God can love them exactly as they are, with all their flaws, doubts, and struggles. Marcel's story reassures them that holiness is not about greatness, but about trust and love. Even the simplest souls, he shows us, can be saints. Today, pilgrims and readers continue to draw strength from Brother Marcel. His writings have been compared to those of Therese herself, not in style, but in spirit. Both voices remind us of the same eternal truth, that God's love is infinite, tender, and close. And perhaps this is why Marcel's legacy matters so much in our modern world. We live in a time when many feel weak, small, and inadequate. People carry heavy burdens, face rejection, and wonder if their lives matter. Marcel's life whispers the answer. Yes, you matter because you are loved beyond measure. He died hidden, poor, and forgotten by the world. Yet today, his witness shines as a beacon of hope. His prison became his pulpit. His silence became his song. His weakness became his crown. From Lisieux to Vietnam, from Therese to Marcel, the little way continues to spread a path of love that anyone, anywhere can walk. And so, the boy who once begged at 7 years old to follow God, who was beaten, mocked, misunderstood, and imprisoned, now stands as a witness to eternity. Servant of God, Brother Marcel Van is not yet canonized, but his life already speaks with the clarity of a saint. Trust in God's love, embrace your littleness, and transform suffering into joy. For in the end, it is not greatness that wins heaven. It is love. The story of Brother Marcel is not just history. It is a call to you, to me, to all who feel too small, too weak, too broken. Saint Thérèse once promised, "I will spend my heaven doing good on earth." In Brother Marcel, she kept that promise, and through him, God whispers again, "You are precious, you are loved, and even the smallest act done with love is eternal."